One further thing that I would add, which is that in many ways the richness of the various contributions in the volume seemed to me to emerge from not just the way in which the question of the educational was being contested, but the ways in which a whole spectrum of informal cultural pedagogies, not education is construed as the operation of an institution, a formal institution like the one we sit in, but rather a whole spectrum of informal cultural pedagogies ranging from the kind of television programming that David Beach describes when he analyzes various initiatives for producing the good consumer in a lot of American and increasingly British television and so forth. So I think that I would hope that maybe the conversation that might emerge around the book would prioritise the ways in which the question of education were being contested, not in order to act as a curative or a palliative or in some way a corrective measure to the formal institutions of education, but rather as the assertion of an absolutely other cultural domain, which is not there in order to address itself as address the deficit of institutional education, but rather to constitute another domain of cultural production, meaning, value, where ultimately the contest of value, happening in a way that's unhooked from the kind of formal apparatus of the state, while at the same time attending in part to the dynamics of the state and the formal sector. But I'll leave it at that and hand over to our chair.
Thank you, Mick and Paul. I think I'd like to immediately ask a question to Hassan Khan, who, with the essay A Simple Turn, addresses also this notion of the turn and this implicit suggestion that sometimes really changing. But as an artist, you also speak about the angry artist, and in this whole process which is happening, I'm wondering, from your position, where's the art? Or where's the position of the artist as discrete objects are disappearing from the curatorial project? To summarize it very briefly, but where's the art?
Superseded by.
But how do you see your own position as an artist, your own practice in relation to this development or this process?
Right. Well, yes, the essay does posit anger as part of the equation that is overlooked in a lot of these kind of discussions. And it tries to look at this anger not necessarily as merely an emotional response, but rather as something that is structurally connected to the position the artist finds him or herself in relation to the way value is negotiated in contemporary art, in the contemporary art landscape somehow. This is connected to, I think, what Paul and Mick are saying, in a sense, because if we ask ourselves, why these four in one day, I mean, quite large things, throwing that word, I mean, there's a very simple, I think, a very, very simple way of understanding that. If you look at the contemporary landscape as an industry that is constantly in need of producing events to maintain its ascendancy in a sense and to maintain its relevance, then you're also dealing with an industry that is kind of also involved in producing fictions of some sort. And for that, the word, I mean, my response to the word turn was related a bit to that, but regardless of the term itself, turn or not, you are as an artist then put in relation to a constantly shifting landscape where value by necessity is something that is unfixed. That is part of what the specificity of art practice is and the art economy is, and at the same time, it is something that is constantly being engineered. And between these two poles, there are many questions, and I would argue, a possible and necessary response is this response of anger. that's just kind of a summary. I don't know if I actually answered your question.
But I'd like to throw the question back to the people around the table who actually are in charge or working at institutions. Because you seem to suggest that there is a necessity, an urge, that you can't resist. At the same time, we also heard that there is a potential to contest through this medium. So I'd like to, maybe Annie, you can respond to this. How do you relate from an institutional position to somehow external question, and at the same time an internal question to use these formats to contest, which is quite contradictory.
Yeah, I guess I can speak from two different positions because of the essay in this book, which was as an invited kind of participant in another institution, and very much a reaction to that space, trying to mirror. We were invited as curators who were trying to simply, we were supposed to curate, and we were thinking about what are the other structures in this institution as well that are kind of assumed and yet visible. Sorry, it was a project called Para Education Department, which we set up, which was an attempt to insert a curatorial program or an idea with an artist and myself. The artist was Sarah Pearce, and the occasion was a collaboration between Wouter Davidts in Rotterdam and Tent, so these two institutions which share a building. And we wanted to kind of trouble a little bit the idea that they wanted to kind of celebrate the notion of invited curators who could kind of spread a certain knowledge, and we were kind of interested in what other spaces these institutions had. The idea of inviting curators to a certain extent meant that it was implicit that we might comment on both curatorial practice within that space or within that city or within that history, and we were kind of fascinated by the fact that there were other very visible but kind of assumed positions like the educational department that just produce something but aren't ever kind of part of that critical discussion. We wanted to suggest that perhaps they were also a very important place in which discourse might happen. But also, for me, always the question around this is who has access to the public sphere. It's a deeply political question, and the space that we might hijack perhaps or mirror by thinking about the notion of para-education might be one which offered other opportunities and necessarily kind of perhaps what Paul referred to earlier, this kind of assured curatorial position, the curatorial author, that it might shared either authorship or at least participation in discussion might be possible. So that was my response to a very kind of institutional moment when I was kind of somebody looking from the outside in, and now I'm working in a big museum. So of course I'm also looking from the other position. I think for me it's very simple. I like very much somehow this questioning of the notion of the turn. What I appreciate very much from this book is the idea not so much of the turn as a moment of fashionability, but actually a book that provides a kind of depth of criticality about a moment in culture. And I think I always think about somebody like Okwuemezor who talks, we can curate within the canon and within a kind of, you know, a fashionability or an urgency to produce the new all the time, which I think Hassan might be talking about, or we could think about curating within culture. And maybe it's not an either or, but there's a certain moment in which I hope often some of us try and ask questions about why, what's necessary right now, what's missing. And I think that for me the notion of discussing the pedagogical or the shared learned experience or trying to create a space for that is very much about the idea of insisting that art is and can be an intellectual experience. But the question about art being an intellectual experience should also be something more open than necessarily who has access to the university or who has access to the public sphere as per being a curator or an artist. But who are the participants? What are we as a public space? And how does one access that intellectual possibility of art? And that really interests me and still interests me as an institution. So I hope that one can find within these spaces not necessarily an assumption that education is something, but that it's a possibility that we can borrow some of these modes as interesting things to put pressure simply on assumed practices within visual art and within visual art curating.